People lie more often than we like to admit, and the harsh reality is that it's not just strangers doing it. It's sometimes the people closest to us. Friends, partners, even family members can twist the truth, and it's hard to face because we want to trust them. I know because I've been there. I used to pride myself on being a good judge of character, the kind of person who could sniff out a lie before it even started. But then I found out someone I deeply trusted had been lying to my face for months. It wasn't that I didn't notice the signs. They were right there, glaring at me. It was that I chose to ignore them. Tiny behavioral shifts, defensive reactions, over-the-top explanations. All the clues were screaming at me, but I convinced myself it was nothing. That's the thing about lies. They aren't always loud. Sometimes they're quiet, subtle, sneaky, and sometimes we turn a blind eye to them because it's easier than confronting the uncomfortable truth. But if you're ready to really see people for who they are, to strip away the illusions and get to the heart of things, you have to face some hard truths. People lie. They lie to protect themselves, to manipulate situations, to avoid accountability. And the sooner you accept that, the sharper your instincts become. One of the most telling signs that someone is lying to you is how quickly they'll change the subject. Have you ever brought up something important, maybe a question you've been holding on to, and the person immediately redirects the conversation? It's almost like they're playing verbal dodgeball, ducking and weaving their way out of the spotlight. I remember being in a relationship where this happened constantly. Every time I'd bring up future plans or anything remotely serious, the topic would shift faster than I could catch it. "What do you think about moving in together?" suddenly turned into, "What should we order for dinner?" Or, "Did you see this funny video on Instagram?" At first I brushed it off. I thought, maybe they're just not ready for that kind of talk, or maybe I'm coming on too strong. But after it kept happening, I realized it wasn't about readiness, it was about avoidance. They didn't want to face the truth of the conversation because it was easier to dodge it. That's the thing about people who lie. They're not just avoiding topics, they're avoiding the responsibility that comes with being honest. And we let them get away with it because we don't want to push too hard. We don't want to be seen as confrontational, so we settle for peace over truth. But when you allow someone to constantly steer the conversation away from the truth, you're silently giving them permission to keep you in the dark. You're choosing comfort over clarity, and that's a dangerous game to play. Trust doesn't just crumble in dramatic, obvious ways. It erodes slowly, piece by piece, every time you let a red flag slide. Another telltale sign of dishonesty is defensiveness. Have you ever asked someone a harmless question only for them to react like you've accused them of a crime? "Hey, did you finish that report?" suddenly becomes, "Why do you always think I'm slacking off? I've been working so hard." That's a red flag. Honest people don't need to overreact. They answer calmly because they have nothing to hide. But liars? They go on the defensive because they're trying to protect themselves, and in doing so, they end up revealing more than they intended. I had a co-worker once who was the king of defensiveness. Every time I'd ask about his part of a group project, he'd lash out with exaggerated excuses. At first, I thought maybe I was being too pushy, but eventually it became clear he wasn't reacting to me. He was reacting to his own guilt. He hadn't done the work, and his defensiveness was his way of covering it up. The truth has a funny way of leaking out through overreaction. When someone's genuinely innocent, they don't feel the need to launch into a monologue about how misunderstood they are. They answer simply and directly. Liars, on the other hand, tend to talk too much, hoping their words will distract you from the truth. Speaking of distractions, let's talk about overly polished details. Have you ever heard someone tell a story so perfect it sounds like it belongs in a movie? Every detail is perfectly placed, the timing is impeccable, and the narrative flows so smoothly that it feels rehearsed. That's because it probably is. Reality is messy, unpredictable, and rarely follows a perfect script. When someone's story is too polished, it's a sign they've spent more time crafting it than living it. I once knew a guy, let's call him Jake, who could tell the most captivating stories. He'd describe his business deals with the kind of cinematic flair that made you feel like you were watching a blockbuster. He'd talk about sealing contracts with dramatic handshakes while gazing out over a city skyline, and for a while, I believed him. But the more I listened, the more the cracks began to show. His stories didn't add up, and when I started asking follow-up questions, the perfect picture he'd painted started to fall apart. That's the thing about lies. They can be rehearsed, but they can't withstand scrutiny. Liars rely on our love for a good story. They count on us wanting their version of events to be true, because it's more exciting, more satisfying than the messy reality. But the truth, it's not polished, it's not perfect, it's raw and real, and that's what makes it believable. The next time someone gives you a story that's too smooth, don't just sit back and enjoy the show. Ask questions, dig deeper. Because the truth isn't afraid of follow-up questions, but lies crumble under scrutiny. And let's not forget about body language. Words can lie, but the body, it has a harder time hiding the truth. Have you ever been in a conversation with someone and noticed they were angled slightly away from you, even as they spoke? It's subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it's a tell. When someone's body turns away, it's like their subconscious is trying to create distance between you and the truth. I've seen this play out countless times, and every time, it's a sign that something's off. I had a friend who would physically turn away whenever our conversations got too personal. At first, I thought it was just a quirk, but eventually I realized it was his way of escaping the vulnerability of the moment. His body was speaking the truth his words wouldn't admit. When someone can't face you directly, it's not just about comfort, it's about confrontation. They're not ready to confront the truth, and their body language betrays them before their words do. The lesson here is simple. Pay attention. People reveal themselves in the smallest ways. Their words, their reactions, their body language. Lies aren't always loud and dramatic. Sometimes they're subtle, hiding in the spaces between what's said and what's left unsaid. But if you stay sharp, stay curious, and don't shy away from asking the tough questions, you'll see through the facade every time. You deserve the truth, even when it's messy, even when it's uncomfortable. And the people who can't give you that? They're not worth your trust. People don't always lie with their words. Sometimes the biggest lies come in the form of avoidance, dismissal, or deflection. Have you ever had someone laugh off a serious conversation like it's nothing? You're there, opening up about something meaningful, maybe a problem you've been holding on to, and they hit you with a chuckle or a sarcastic comment, brushing it aside like it's no big deal. At first it might seem harmless, maybe even a way to lighten the mood, but if it happens often, it's a sign they're dodging something deeper. I remember being in a relationship where this happened constantly. Whenever I tried to address a serious issue, anything from how I was feeling to something we needed to work on, the response was always the same: laughter. "You're overthinking it," they'd say with a grin, or "Relax, it's not that deep." At first I let it slide, convincing myself they just had a light-hearted approach to things. But over time I realized it was more than that. They weren't just laughing, they were dismissing the conversation entirely. Humor is often used as a shield, a way to avoid accountability. Instead of engaging in a difficult conversation, they make it a joke, turning the spotlight away from the issue at hand. And the thing is, we often let them get away with it because we don't want to come across as overly serious or confrontational. But here's the truth: serious topics deserve serious attention. When someone consistently laughs off what matters to you, It's a sign they're not willing or ready to face the truth. The same goes for vagueness. Have you ever pressed someone for specifics only to get a cloud of ambiguity in return? You ask a direct question, and instead of a straightforward answer, they give you something like, "Oh, it's complicated," or "I'll tell you more later." It's frustrating, isn't it? It's like trying to grasp smoke with your hands. No matter how hard you try, it slips away. I had a co-worker who was a master at this. He'd talk about big projects he was supposedly working on, making it sound like he was always on the verge of a breakthrough. But whenever anyone asked for details, names, timelines, results, he'd get vague. "Oh, we're in the early stages," he'd say. Or, "I can't share too much right now, but it's huge." Weeks later, it would turn out there was no project, no deal, no progress. It was all smoke and mirrors. Here's what I've learned. Vagueness is a liar's best friend. It gives them room to maneuver, to evade accountability. When someone can't give you clear answers, it's not just a sign they're unprepared. It's often a sign they're hiding something. Honest people don't dance around the truth. They don't need to. If they don't know the answer, they'll admit it. If they're working on something real, they'll give you the details. Vagueness, on the other hand, is a strategy. It's a way to stall, to deflect, to avoid being pinned down. And here's the tricky part. We've all been vague at some point, haven't we? Maybe we weren't ready to share something, or we were embarrassed to admit we didn't have all the information. But there's a difference between being momentarily unclear and deliberately evasive. The latter is a red flag, and it's one we shouldn't ignore. Another thing I've noticed is how body language can betray someone's intentions. Words are easy to control, but the body, not so much. Have you ever been in a conversation where someone's body seems to lean away from you, even as they're talking? It's subtle. Maybe their feet are angled toward the door, or their torso is slightly turned, but it's there. It's like their body is saying, "I don't want to be here," even if their words say otherwise. I've seen this play out so many times, especially when the conversation gets uncomfortable. One time, I was speaking with a friend about a serious issue, something that had been bothering me for months. As I spoke, I noticed her body shift ever so slightly. Her arms crossed, her chair angled away. It was as if she was trying to physically distance herself from the weight of the conversation. And sure enough, when I pressed further, it became clear she wasn't being entirely truthful about her role in the issue. Her words said one thing, but her body told a different story. Body language doesn't lie. It's an instinctive response, something people do without realizing it. When someone turns away from you during a serious conversation, it's not just about discomfort, it's about avoidance. It's their subconscious trying to escape a situation they don't want to face. And the sad part? Most of us brush it off. We tell ourselves we're imagining it, or that it doesn't mean anything. But it does. It always does. Then there's the issue of over-polished stories. You know the ones, the tales that are so perfectly crafted. They sound like they belong in a movie. Every detail is just right. Every moment plays out like a script. It's tempting to believe these stories because they're entertaining, they're neat, they're satisfying. But here's the thing, life isn't neat. It's messy, unpredictable, and full of imperfections. When someone's story is too polished, it's usually because they've taken the time to craft it, and not in a good way. I once knew someone who loved to tell elaborate stories about their achievements. They'd describe business deals with dramatic flair, down to the color of the pen they used to sign the contract. At first, I was impressed. Who wouldn't be? But over time, the cracks began to show. Little inconsistencies, details that didn't quite add up. When I started asking questions, the carefully constructed narrative began to unravel. And that's the thing about liars. They can rehearse all they want, but they can't handle follow-up questions. Real life doesn't come with a script, and when someone's story is too smooth, it's usually because it's fiction. What all these behaviors have in common, laughing off serious topics, vagueness, defensive body language, over-polished stories, is that they're ways of avoiding the truth. People lie for many reasons: fear, shame, manipulation, even self-preservation. But at the end of the day, a lie is a lie, no matter how it's packaged. And if you're not paying attention, if you're not willing to ask the tough questions or confront the uncomfortable moments, those lies will slip right past you. Here's the hard truth: you deserve honesty. You deserve people in your life who can face difficult conversations, give you clear answers, and be real with you, even when it's hard. And if someone can't do that, if they're constantly dodging, deflecting, or dressing up their lies, it's worth asking yourself if there's someone you can truly trust. Because trust isn't built on convenience or comfort. It's built on truth, no matter how messy or imperfect it may be. Sometimes the most obvious lies are the ones we convince ourselves not to see. It's not that the red flags aren't there. It's that we choose to ignore them because the alternative is uncomfortable. Facing a lie means confronting the possibility that someone you trust isn't being honest with you, and that realization is never easy to swallow. But the longer you let it slide, the deeper the cracks grow, until one day everything comes crumbling down. One of the most subtle ways people lie is through their reactions, or overreactions, to be more precise. Have you ever noticed how some people go out of their way to defend themselves, even when there's no real accusation? You ask a casual question like, "Did you see the email I sent?" And suddenly they're on a tirade about how busy they've been, how hard they're working, and how unfair it is for you to assume they'd missed something. It's a defensive reaction that feels completely out of proportion to the situation, and it's often a dead giveaway. I once worked with someone who was a pro at this. Any time a project deadline came up, I'd check in to make sure everything was on track. A normal question, right? But instead of answering directly, they'd launch into an over-the-top explanation about how much they had on their plate, how late they'd been staying up to get everything done, and how they didn't need to be micromanaged. The first couple of times I brushed it off as stress. But as the pattern continued, it became clear. They weren't reacting to my question, they were reacting to their own guilt. They hadn't done the work, and their exaggerated defensiveness was their way of trying to shift the blame. That's the thing about overreacting. It's like a smokescreen. People think that by going big, they'll distract you from the real issue. But if you look closely, the overreaction itself is the issue. Honest people don't need to blow up when asked a simple question. They don't need to cover their tracks with dramatic explanations. They answer calmly and directly because they have nothing to hide. Liars, on the other hand, can't help but let their guilt seep through their words. Another subtle way people lie is through their lack of detail or their overuse of it. It sounds contradictory, but hear me out. When someone is telling the truth, their stories are usually straightforward. They don't need to embellish or dodge because they're speaking from experience. But liars, they either get too vague or too polished. They either dance around the details with phrases like, "It's complicated," or "I can't really explain it right now," or they go to the other extreme and craft a narrative so perfect it feels rehearsed. I had a friend who was a master of over-detailing. She could describe an event with such precision, it felt like you were watching a scene from a movie. Every moment, every expression, every emotion was laid out perfectly. At first, I found it fascinating. Her storytelling was captivating. But over time, the cracks started to show. The details were too perfect, too consistent, almost robotic. When I asked follow-up questions, she'd stumble, her carefully constructed story unraveling in real time. That's the thing about lies. They might sound flawless, but they don't hold up under scrutiny. On the flip side, there's vagueness, and this one is particularly frustrating. You ask someone a direct question, and instead of a clear answer, you get a fog of ambiguity. "Oh, I'm working on it," or "it's in progress," or the classic, "I can't really explain it right now." It's maddening because you know they're avoiding the question, but calling them out feels awkward, so you let it slide. That's exactly what they're counting on. Vagueness is a liar's safety net. It keeps them from committing to anything concrete, which means they can't be pinned down later. The reality is, honest people don't hide behind vagueness. If they don't know something, they'll say so. If they need more time, they'll explain why. Vagueness is a strategy, and it's one that relies on your unwillingness to push for clarity. The next time someone gives you a vague answer, don't let it go. Ask for specifics. Watch how they react. An honest person will provide clarity. A liar will double down on their ambiguity. Body language is another window into the truth, and it's one we often overlook. Words can lie, but the body has a harder time hiding what it really feels. One of the most telling signs is when someone turns their body away from you during a conversation. It's subtle. Maybe their feet are angled toward the door or their torso is slightly shifted, but it speaks volumes. It's like their subconscious is trying to create distance, even as their words say, "I'm engaged." I once had a friend who did this every time we got into a heavy discussion. At first, I thought it was just a nervous habit, but over time, I realized it only happened when the conversation touched on something he didn't want to address. His body was betraying his discomfort, even as his words tried to keep up the facade. That's the thing about body language. It's honest, even when the person isn't. And then there's the classic laugh-it-off tactic. You bring up something serious, and they brush it off with a joke or a sarcastic comment. At first, it might seem like they're just trying to lighten the mood, but if it happens consistently, it's a sign they're avoiding the conversation altogether. Humor is a powerful tool, but in the wrong hands, it becomes a way to deflect and dodge accountability. I was once in a relationship where this happened all the time. I'd try to talk about something important, maybe how I was feeling or an issue we needed to work on, and the response was always the same. A laugh, followed by, "You're overthinking it," or "Don't be so serious." At first I let it go, thinking they just had a light-hearted approach to things. But over time, I realized it wasn't light-heartedness. It was avoidance. They didn't want to deal with the weight of the conversation, so they turned it into a joke. That's the thing about lies. They don't always come with grand gestures or obvious tells. Sometimes they're as subtle as a shift in body language, a vague response, or a laugh at the wrong moment. And the danger isn't just in the lies themselves. It's in how easily we ignore them. We convince ourselves that we're overthinking, that we're being too sensitive, that it's not a big deal. But the truth is, those little lies add up. They chip away at trust, bit by bit, until there's nothing left. The good news? You don't have to fall for it. By paying attention to the small signs, the defensiveness, the vagueness, the body language, you can start to see the truth hidden beneath the surface. It's not about being confrontational or accusatory. It's about valuing honesty enough to ask the hard questions, because at the end of the day, you deserve the truth, no matter how messy or uncomfortable it may be. Here's the thing about lies. They thrive in the spaces where we're too afraid to dig deeper. People lie because they're counting on your hesitation, your politeness, your unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And the longer you let those lies linger, the more they grow, spreading like cracks in the foundation of trust until one day everything collapses. But here's the truth. You don't have to let it get that far. By recognizing the patterns, by paying attention to the small signs, you can stop the lies in their tracks. One of the most subtle but telling signs of dishonesty is when someone avoids eye contact. It's something so instinctive, so automatic, that most of us don't even think about it. But when someone is lying, their eyes often betray them. They'll glance away, look down, or avoid meeting your gaze altogether. It's as if their eyes can't bear the weight of the truth they're hiding. I've seen this play out countless times, but one moment stands out. I was talking to a friend about something they'd promised to do, something important, and as I asked why it hadn't been done, their eyes darted everywhere but at me. They gave excuses, explanations, reasons that sounded plausible enough, but their inability to hold eye contact told me everything I needed to know. They weren't being honest, and deep down, they knew it. The thing about eye contact is that it's not just about looking someone in the eye, it's about connection. When someone can't face you directly, it's a physical manifestation of the emotional distance they're creating with their lies. And the worst part, we often convince ourselves it doesn't mean anything. Oh, they're just shy, we think, or maybe they're uncomfortable with confrontation. But discomfort with the truth is exactly what makes someone look away. It's their subconscious trying to escape the moment. Another common tactic liars use is over-explaining. Have you ever asked someone a simple question, and instead of a straightforward answer, you get a long-winded story packed with unnecessary details? It's like they're trying to fill the silence with so much noise that you won't notice what's missing. They pile on the words, hoping to distract you, to overwhelm you, to make you forget what you were asking in the first place. I had a co-worker who was notorious for this. Anytime something went wrong on a project, and I asked for an explanation, they'd launch into a monologue about how hard they'd been working, how complicated the task was, and how everyone else was to blame. By the time they finished, I was so buried in their web of words that I couldn't even remember what I'd asked them in the first place. That's the thing about over-explaining. It's not about providing clarity, it's about creating confusion. Honest people don't need to over-explain. They answer directly, succinctly, because the truth doesn't need dressing up. Liars, on the other hand, feel the need to justify themselves, to spin a narrative that sounds believable, but ultimately distracts from the core issue. The next time someone gives you an answer that feels like it's trying too hard, pay attention. What are they not saying? What's buried beneath all those extra words? And then there's the classic tactic of turning the tables. You ask a question, and instead of answering, they make it about you. "Why do you always assume the worst?" they'll say, or "You're so paranoid. Why can't you trust me?" It's a clever move because it shifts the focus away from them and onto you. Suddenly, you're the one defending yourself, even though they're the one who should be explaining. I experienced this firsthand in a past relationship. I'd bring up something that didn't sit right with me, maybe a story that didn't add up or a behavior that felt off, and instead of addressing my concerns, they'd flip the script. "Why are you so suspicious all the time?" they'd ask, or "You're imagining things, you need to stop overthinking." At first, I doubted myself. Maybe I was overthinking, maybe I was being unfair. But eventually, I realized it was a tactic to avoid accountability. They weren't addressing the issue because they couldn't. The truth was too uncomfortable for them to face. Turning the tables is a form of manipulation, plain and simple. It's designed to make you second-guess yourself, to make you feel like the problem is you instead of them. But here's the truth. If someone values you and the relationship you share, they'll address your concerns directly. They won't make you feel crazy for asking questions. They won't dodge or deflect. They'll face the hard conversations head-on, because that's what honesty looks like. And then there's the silence, the unspoken lie. Sometimes people don't need to say anything at all to deceive you. They just leave out key details, hoping you won't notice the gaps. It's a quiet kind of dishonesty, but it's just as damaging as an outright lie. In fact, it's often worse because it feels insidious, harder to detect, easier to rationalize. I'll never forget the time a close friend lied to me by omission. It wasn't what they said that hurt me. It was what they didn't say. They'd made a decision that impacted both of us, but instead of telling me, they kept it to themselves. When I found out later, I felt betrayed, not just because of the decision itself, but because they didn't trust me enough to be honest. That's the thing about omissions. They erode trust quietly, leaving you to wonder what else hasn't been said. The truth is, honesty isn't just about the words people say. It's about the words they don't. It's about transparency, about being open even when it's uncomfortable. When someone keeps things from you, whether out of fear, shame, or selfishness, it creates a void. And the longer that void exists, the harder it becomes to rebuild the trust that's been lost. What all these behaviors, avoiding eye contact, over-explaining, turning the tables and lying by omission, have in common is that they're ways of avoiding the truth. They're defense mechanisms, ways for people to protect themselves at the expense of your trust. But here's the good news. The more you pay attention, the more you'll start to see the patterns. And once you see them, you can choose how to respond. You don't have to accept dishonesty. You don't have to let people manipulate you, deflect, or hide behind half-truths. You deserve relationships built on real trust, real connection, and real honesty. And the people who can't give you that, maybe it's time to let them go. Because the truth, messy, uncomfortable, imperfect, is always worth more than the most convincing lie.